Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage.
I'm Elise Adler. I'm the director of events here, and I love my job, and it's always great to see everybody, and I get to say thank you for coming, thank you for shopping local and supporting Parnassus Books, and it's because you guys come to these events that we get to have them. So thank you so much. And I just realized that I left my introduction in the back. So this is going to be really interesting. Okay, so one thing is we can turn off our phones. I remember that. So let's see if I remember. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. He's written books of poetry and theology and memoir, and there are so many books that he's had, and he's got his podcast. And this year, he is celebrating, this 2025, a Poetry Unbound collection, the 44 poems on being with each other. And also, these are original poems, kitchen hymns. And what's inside is amazing, but this is one of the greatest covers ever, I'm just saying. I mean, it is a hymn book, and it's stained like if it was in the kitchen. So it's really great. So we are celebrating him, and I believe that the 44 poems is now on the top 10 list, hardback nonfiction in Ireland. And that's really great. Yeah, give him applause. And tonight, he's in conversation with Major Jackson, one of our favorite hometown poets. And Dee Dee, I just want to recognize you as well. Dee Dee Jackson, another wonderful poet. And Major has, I think he's got 6 collections of poetry. And I do want to say, because I don't have it written down in front of me, he just won an inaugural award from the Yale Library. And he won that award, so yeah. So we've got 2 fabulous poets and all of you, so let's bring them out here, Pádraig Ó Tuama and Major Jackson.
Good evening, everyone. Nice. I just learned that Patrick is no stranger to Nashville, Tennessee, and this trip marks his 20th trip to, so let's give him an honorary, warm Nashvillian welcome, which leads me to thinking about our brief but fast friendship pre-global pandemic. In fact, I want to say it was that February, right? January. And you were just about to launch the podcast.
Yep, we had a little launch meal in New York City.
That's right.
And you came along.
In Soho. Yes.
That's right.
And what you don't know is I flew in that day from Florida and then flew back that night to Florida.
Amazing.
So it really was a...
Well, you really did come for that.
I did, yeah.
That's amazing.
So I'm going to stay on brand. Since turning 50s, in my 50s, I get very sentimental. So Pádraig is going to read for about 12, 15 minutes, but I'm going to read something that will amount to a note of gratitude. And maybe I speak for a lot of people here. I want to first begin with a public note of gratitude for your limitless energy and work, first as a poet. I find Kitchen Hymns to be deeply moving and a courageous book, powerful for how it utters the unsayable and opens up the possibility of a richer and wider humanity, how it makes interrogation and questioning its own aesthetic. Kitchen Hymns appeals to my inner ear that reaches for work that models self-reckoning both in sound and in temperament. I hear tenderness, I hear humor. One poem begins, titled The Book of Revelation, What's your love language? Leaving, she replies. I hear rage, I hear playfulness, I hear an eroticism, I hear deep pockets of soulful exploration that some might argue is bluesy. The poet Charles Wright utters somewhere a line of verse should be a station on the cross. That's a weighty demand, but one that always goes noticed by those who are quieted by society, who understand the particular pleasures of revelations. You make us being with ourselves and each other another day, tolerable, joyful, even in the face of the mysteries. I want to thank you for serving as an emissary of the art of poetry. Your anthologies, readings, podcasts, and talks have enriched our appreciation for an art that renders mute any questions about the role of poetry in our lives. In this regard, for this reason, though we've different parentals, I've always considered you a brother in the art. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. Okay.
Thank you very much, Major. Thank you to Parnassus, and thank you to you for coming on Friday night for some poetry and some conversation. I'm very moved that you took some time out of your evening. I've got a little bit of a sniffle. I'm feeling just fine, but every now and then, because I've only got two hands, I'm going to have to put one of these things down in order to, not snot all over the place. I'm going to read a little bit from Kitchen Hymns. One of Emily Dickinson's earliest poems, a very, very early poem, is very short. In the name of the bee and of the butterfly and of the breeze, amen. 3 alliterative bees. So here's a poem called In the Name of the Bee. I asked the grasses if they believed, but they said believe is a poor verb. I asked the sun, but it had eclipsed. I asked the tree, and it said stand. I asked the field mouse, it nibbled a seed in my outstretched hand. I asked the hare, but it didn't stop. I asked the ground, but it just kept spinning. Things grew, then died, then rotted, then renewed the soil. New things grew. I went to ask the bee about the future, but it had gone extinct with a bead of nectar on its tongue. I asked the song thrush about the soul, and it sang until a gate to hell opened. I asked the mountain what mattered. It said nothing. Much of this was written living on the borderlands between County Fermanagh and County Donegal in the northwest of Ireland. And there were 3 generations of hares living in the backyard. A jackrabbit, is that what you call that here? The big ones, they don't burrow, they're huge. And we call them gyria in Irish, the low deer. They're extraordinary. And also there were song thrushes in the backyard. And in Irish mythology, the hare is the messenger to the underworld, and the song thrush, wherever there's a song thrush, there's a gate to the underworld, because the fairies like the sound of their music, because the song thrush sings every phrase twice. That's how you know the difference between a song thrush and a nightingale, that the song thrush sings a phrase and then repeats it. So therefore I was thinking a lot about the underworld during that time, and it was COVID, and I've studied theology, so I was thinking, in the context of the underworld, I was thinking about Jesus of Nazareth in the underworld. And I'm not a believer formally, although I've studied a lot of theology. But what interests me is to take these characters very seriously and psychologically seriously. So I take psychologically seriously that he thought he was God. And I thought, what would it be like for him to meet his equal? And what would it be like for him to stop believing in God after he'd gone to Hades? And there's only one person he could meet who would be his equal, who is Persephone, the queen of destruction, who is the daughter of the goddess of agriculture in Greek mythology. And so there's a bit of a sequence called In a Garden by a Gate that I'll read you a few from. And this, the he said, she said, is Jesus and Persephone. She's been in and out of hell for eternity. That's, when she goes down, winter happens. When she comes back up, spring arises. It's his first time. The gate to the garden. She heard him, of course. She wondered who he was and where he came from. How? She'd made the rules. She knew he could only do this on his own. One glimpse back, one hand, one turn would send him packing. He was bleeding. She could smell the iron in the air. He imagined it was nearly over. It took her centuries, forgetting everything at every turn, thinking she was new when she was anything but new. Nothing worked to help her. She gave nothing now but curiosity. She felt the final scratch of winter on her skin. Man's search for meaning. "Could you get me some water?" he said. She looked at him and said, "Who died and made you God?" He closed his eyes, said, "I'm thirsty." "And what am I to you?" she replied. "Some servant you can order? I waited for you, but not on you. I dragged you to the shade and kept you safe, warded off the insects, smelling out your clot and sweat. I covered your body with my clothes. You get me some water." He said, "Where's the well?" "There isn't one," she said. "Then is there a river?" he asked. "A mountain stream? Is there rain here? Where are we?" "A garden," she said. "A place I come to often." "Can I stay?" he asked. "Nobody can stay," she said. So these poems, between the two of them, are kind of built on a level of something like Socratic dialogue, except they're questions of survival rather than questions of existentialism. Here's another one from them, on the nature of forgetting. She'd seen his wounds. Who couldn't? But she knew she shouldn't ask until he'd settled down a bit. So she watched, waited, saw him bend his knees while he was standing, balancing on the front part of his feet, tightening the muscles of his ass and thighs, always scanning the horizon, planning his escape. She looked at his bare back, his gasping, panicked chest, his mangled ankles. "Who did this to you?" she asked at last. "I forget," he said. "Forget? Or won't remember?" she asked. "Is there a difference?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I can see you need to talk, so talk to me. If not me, anyone, anything, the sky, the earth, a fucking tree. Can't," he said. "Don't want to either." Just two more from this. Major read the first line of this one. If there are any of you who love the book, The 5 Love Languages, I'm very sorry. Jesus likes it too. You'll be gratified to know that. Apparently there's a new edition of it coming out called The 8 Love Languages. I'm not joking. They want your money. The Book of Revelation. "What's your love language?" he asked. "Leaving," she replied. No, he said, "there's 5. Words of affirmation, touch, and gifts. The 4th is time, and damn, I forget the 5th. I know it rhymes with purpose." "Where do you get this shit?" she said. "Anyway, all of them, and death, hunger too, and things I don't have the words for." "It doesn't work like that," he said. "In the book, you answer 50 questions and get results by turning to the end." "You and your certitudes," she said. Come on, he said, "just play along. Which one's yours? Words or touch or time or gifts or service?" "That's the 5th. "Did you love your kids?" she asked. "Of course I did," he said. "How?" she said. "With words or touch or time or gifts or piles of knickers, jocks and socks left laundered on the landing?" Fine, you've made your point," he said. "If you want to know, mine is words of affirmation." "I bet you yours is time." Part of the curiosity I have about these two characters is that they're both gods. They needed to meet their equal, but they're both also violated, traumatized characters. Persephone was raped and abducted and taken to Hades. Jesus of Nazareth was more than likely, according to the Gospel of Luke, raped also before he was crucified by a Roman torture mechanism. And so this in many ways is a study of the lyric address, the word you, but also it's a study of how is it that you live with yourself and live with stories. So there's a poem in here that's only in here because Carrie Gibson, my very, very dear old friend, read through this book on a level that can only be called forensic. I've only ever stayed with Carrie when I've come to Nashville these 20 times. So this is a poem that is in here because of Carrie. Whosoever shall deny me, I will also deny. And you, he said, who did this to you? He said he didn't have a choice, she said. He said nature or an arrow made him do it. I reject such fatalism. I build fires with that language. I can't abide someone who can't admit complicity or a failure. That's why I'll not stay with you much longer, she said, though it upsets me. Back to you.
So every poet in the room, and I'm going to particularly say every poet in the room, has been asked this question, what are your poems are about? Which always seizes us, right? But the poet Robert Creeley was asked this question in the last century by someone, and the person said, are those real poems, or did you just make them up? With the presumption, of course, that poems can only be written by those who are not alive, and everyone else is an imposter. I love that anecdote because it allows me to ask, how do you describe kitchen hymns to readers?
Well, the phrase kitchen hymns comes from the northwest of Ireland. The hymns that were sung at home but not in the chapel were called kitchen hymns. And the reasons they weren't sung in the chapel is because they were in Irish, Gaelic, you might say, not in Latin. And it's not like they were scandalous hymns. They were extraordinarily intimate hymns. The devotion of them was a devotion that came from the reality of being alive. So in one of the most famous kitchen hymns, Mary is singing to the corpse of her son. And she says, O my vachin wirnach, let the shronin garhas brishta. O my sweet darling son, with your small nose torn and broken. Sweet darling son, small nose. Here you're in the language of a woman who is holding the corpse of her son, but also remembering when he was a boy and maybe had an injury. And this poem, this kitchen hymn clearly came from the lives of women in the northwest of Ireland who were mixing their own grief in with the blank slate of religion in order to tell their own lives, not just to pay obeisance to a story that was larger than they. They were making their own story larger by joining it to a grand story. And that's really what kitchen hymns is about, I suppose. It's the question as to what happens when you utter an intimate you, when you try to wonder what would it be like if I, or characters that I've made up, which are clearly projections of me, but also something else, what would be happen if they said things to each other that they need to say to each other, and figure out what happens then?
I think I absolutely picked up on the projection, which had me think about casting forward imaginatively these very familiar characters to some extent. One Greek, one obviously Christian, but it leads me to ask Pádraig, what was necessary in your life to complete this book? What advantages or privileges, and maybe going in the other direction, what shifts of attitude or healing was necessary in order for you to complete Kitchen Hymns?
I mean, one of the big questions in it, there's 13 or 15 poems in it, all with the same title, Do You Believe in God? And I'm interested in tangible responses to that abstract question. And so I kind of like the idea that if somebody asked me if I believe in God, that I can say, hey, check it out, there's a hare. And that's a perfectly reasonable answer to say that, to respond in the here and now to something that has an imagination of the hereafter. And I suppose one of the things that Kitchen Hymns was working out for me is how to find a language to respond to that, a language that isn't about evasion, but it is about saying, I'm utterly uninterested in the answer of yes or no, and I'm deeply interested in the answer of here, and what happens here. You know, all the traumas of life, the joys of life, the discoveries of phenomenology that we're all in, you know, things happen all the time. And so that interested me to make an exploration of that.
Yeah, I have a question here about how, in a very real sense, you take advantage of poetry's elusiveness by not answering or providing. I mean, the question just threads through, and you have these wonderful responses. It was like tonguing the gap where the tooth was. And then earlier, it was like a storm in its eye. And so the idea of the presence of the divine, the absence of divine being the thing that kind of defines our reality is all in this book, even as you project onto these characters. Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested in the concept of desire, and all religion has a relationship with the question of desire. A silly story about desire is that at the beginning of COVID, I'd had to rush home from New Zealand, and so my bag had been trashed by various airlines, and so it was completely mangled and unrepairable. So I needed to buy a new bag, and I knew that I wasn't in a great rush, and there's the Swiss company who make recycled bags out of recycled material, and I thought, oh, I'll get one. But they only had blue bags, and I don't like blue. It's lovely on you, all of you who are wearing blue, but I just don't like it. And so I waited, because nobody was going anywhere. I waited until a bag came in the color that I liked, a kind of a purplish color. It took a few months, and I checked the website every 10 days or so. And then it arrived, and I put it in the back of the cupboard because I was going nowhere. None of us were. But I realized I missed my looking. I found myself back on the website. I didn't want to get another one, and I was perfectly happy with the one I had. But I missed my yearning. And therefore, that shows that all desire is in relationship to a certain form of absence, and that the presence of desire is entirely engaging with the presence of an absence. And sometimes to fill that absence can actually be a crisis. And that's also at the heart of Kitchen Hymns. This word nothing occurs everywhere, or no one as well. There's an epigraph in this from Paul Celan, the extraordinary Jewish poet, German-speaking Romanian, whose life was ravaged by his parents being taken to a death camp, and him in a ghetto translating. He translated Shakespeare into German as a way of to pass the time in a ghetto. And he has this line in a poem of his called Psalm, where he says, "Blessed are you, no one." And to think about the presence of an absence and the necessary presence of an absence. There's a character in this book at one point who calls God my favorite emptiness. And I don't mean that in any form of disrespect. I mean it as the closest thing I can come to putting language that I actually believe and where I'm not lying. Because I tried not to lie in this book.
Can I go back to that cheeky declaration by Charles Wright that says each line should be a station on the cross? I think I know the answer to this because one of your speakers in the poem says, sacrifice is not salvation. Beauty fades, purpose too, and certitude. But let me ask, is suffering a precondition to writing poetry? And what terms should we use then to express at least what I read as the tinctures of sacrifice, even in poems of joy, because we are giving something?
The first thing that comes to mind is a line from a poem by Dante Michaud, a great American poet who spends a lot of time living in England. It's a poem that he wrote for the baptism of his godchild. And he's theologically involved, Dante is, and he has this great line when he says, "Baptize you in the sign of the cross? Pah! There is no miracle in an instrument of death." I read that years ago and thought, who is he? And have essentially stalked him online and become friendly with him as a result. There is no miracle in an instrument of death. What a great line. And so I think living is a precondition of poetry. And living, of course, is filled with everything from yearning to lament, to rage, to injustice, to the desire for change, to actual change, to disappointment, to surprise, to unexpected things. Emily Dickinson says that we are finite infinitude, which is that we have an imagination of eternity, knowing that we are not eternal. And that, of course, causes a certain form of lament. I'll be 50 this year, and there's something about turning a decade where you think, okay, you know, when I was younger, we bought my dad a pair of jeans when he was 50, his first pair of jeans in his life, and we thought, isn't it hilarious that an old man would be wearing a pair of jeans? And whenever he wore them, we thought it was hilarious. And I'll be 50 in October. So there's something about, I don't mean the tragic grief of time, but just that time is doing its own thing, and that we are subject to it, and the pain that comes with that, and therefore the creativity. And it's got all of the elements in it. Sometimes joy, sometimes sorrow, sometimes rage, sometimes protest, all of those.
One of my favorite poems in the book, and I wonder if you could punctuate this conversation with the reading of it, is Charade.
Oh, really?
It feels quite different
Yeah.
to some extent to your typical poems, in that it feels surreal, but not that kind of surrealist disruption of reality, but maybe because of its mild distortion and amplification of reality.
Yeah. Okay. This is a 2 and a bit page poem, just so you can prepare yourself. There's a character throughout the book called Mother Brendan. I don't know who she is. She wandered into my unconscious one day when I was raging in New York City, and she just walked in and took over. And so she's a kind of a self-ordained anarchist priest who doesn't believe in anything, but she believes
That's why
in nothing.
I loved it.
Yeah.
Got it.
So do you call it charades here too? Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure if that translated across the Atlantic or not. So she's also a teacher. So she's in a class and she's leading them in a game of charades. Charade. Let's play charades, children, Mother Brendan said. You know the rules? No mouthing, no signing. Simply hold a concept in your person and let us pick up the vibe. Donal went first. He just stood up. He beamed. He was delighted with himself. Ontology! The children squealed, and everybody clapped. Lovely way to start, Donal, Mother B said. Easy, but elegantly done. So, someone else. Make it tough. Quietly, with no rush, Charade got up and, without touching anything, moved the light about. Faces shadowed and unshadowed. They saw things they hadn't seen before. They wondered how they'd lived before they knew what they now knew. If that wasn't a representation of Sartre's preferences for a process of becoming as a critique of a more static Heideggerian concept of being, Brendan said, I don't know what was. Comparative analysis, not just propositional. Bravo, Charade. Good girl yourself. Breffney walked into the middle of the room, and one child, then another followed, moved near him, motionless yet alert, stopped. Were they waiting? Praying? Decaying? Some looked hungry, others looked like prey. Equi-primordiality, the watching children sighed, enraptured. Breffney, Mother said, philosophers are reassembling their atoms just to shake your hand. Raffi took the stage, looking burdened, headached, grey. Life went pale on faces. The class, already quiet, went quieter. No one made a sound. They approached the edge of nothing, feeling fear, annihilation. Years collapsed. Then, imperceptibly, like the moment winter changes, something, a crocus, the work of what a smile can do. The mind called back, Bruises cured themselves. Psychoneuroimmunology. Mother Brendan scanned around, saw excitement and exhaustion. It was time to end. She left them to their own devices for a while. Some read, some put their head down on their arms and slept. But then someone murmured from their dream. Someone's face went pale. Someone stared across the room. One child drew a circle on a circle on a circle, couldn't stop. Mother Brendan chewed her sleeve. How much time had passed? Then she noticed Fatima, sunk into her chair, drawing everybody's energy to herself. Fatima saw that she'd been caught, grinned, and dropped her hold. Who taught you about the quantum unconscious? Brendan said, but Fatima just smiled. Children, time in the future is visiting us today with experiences of the past we have not yet unpacked. You'll see, and you'll remember. Now, have you no homes to go to? Out you go. I should say where that came from. This is the creative component of a PhD that I did in the University of Glasgow, and my supervisor said, look, you're going to have to prove to your examiners that you're familiar with concepts of philosophy. And I hate being told what to do. I absolutely hate it. And so she said, can you submit something that shows that you're able to engage with questions of, quantum unconscious, questions to do with phenomenology, etc. So I presented that, which was a little bit of a screw you. And she loved it. So,
It's a brilliant poem. Very rangy, but also, and this is a book full of kind of lyric poems, and so to encounter that narrative was a really sweet encounter. Yeah. You use dialogue as you discussed earlier, so there's a bit of drama, and what is uttered even in that poem resonates out such that this line I'm thinking, let there be lights let there be lights in the vaults of the sky. Nothing of my life is what I thought my life would be. And these are spoken by characters and maybe channeled through you, but they're hugely applicable. Talk to me about that channeling, that power.
Well, I'm interested in the particular. I'm always interested in the particular. I think if you try to write the universal, you'll fail. Whereas if you try to write the particular, well, something curious might happen. That's strange. And I don't think there's such a thing as the universal. I think there's the thing as a conversation and what happens in a quantum engagement. And so the more I went into Jesus and Persephone, the more Persephone especially said things like that. Nothing of my life is what I thought my life would be. Persephone means queen of destruction. She's kind of in charge of Hades. And to hear her own lament in the midst of her power and then her rage and critique in that poem that I read earlier on, there's a way within which I suppose I was trying to critique ambition of power and achievement, the idea that that's going to get you the capacity to do whatever you want. Here's Persephone, and she's saying, this isn't what I'd have chosen. And that's true for so many of us, I think. And if it's not, it will be. So
it's a haunting. So you and I do something. We have a podcast.
We do.
And our podcast, at the center of it is poetry. And what I deeply admire about your podcast, not that you have to say what you deeply admire about my
I haven't
podcast,
prepared. Yeah.
Is how you read through these poems your own life. You don't come to it like a professor of poetry. You tell stories, you recall. I'm thinking about Benjamin Zephaniah's poem. You recall real moments that these poems address. Talk to me about, how do you select? Everyone wants to know, how do you choose a poem for your podcast? and where does it reach the bar for you such that this can be something that a larger public might enjoy and glean something out of?
Yeah. Well, how I select is I read a lot, same as you. I read a lot and just try to make sure to keep a whole list of, oh, this would work, this would work, this would work. And when it comes time to thinking, oh, we've got a 16-episode season or a 24-episode season, to think, what's a nice mix? Because you want a mix of poets from different backgrounds. You want a mix of poems that are doing different things. You know, I wouldn't do 24 sonnets, for instance, much know as I love sonnets. Nor would I do 24 poems that are all in one kind of character or one kind of register. They have to be, they can't be too long because it's typically 12 to 15 minutes long. So that we don't have to put the explicit thing on the podcast thing. They can't have hugely strong language. They can kind of have a bit, but not enormously. And I suppose I just want to make sure that they are poems that are in conversation with life. I bristle sometimes when people talk about accessible poetry and inaccessible poetry. I don't like that distinction. A poem has its own life, and what might seem to be utterly incomprehensible might still stick with you. It's a line that I've remembered probably weekly since I learnt it as a teenager. Lie at the heart of the emotion, time has its own work to do, from Patrick Kavanagh. And I don't need to comprehend that in order to feel the wisdom of it, or to feel maybe not even the wisdom, to feel something else. There's lines that just occur and occur and occur to you. So it's poems that, in a certain sense, work as what Don Patterson says, a little machine to remember themselves, that they're folded into themselves. That's what he says a poem is, that they're folded into themselves and they present themselves as something. Emily Dickinson says that a poem, you know you've read a poem when it blows your head off, which is another lovely way to talk about something. When you have a physical experience in that, and that I think is part of my curiosity. Where does my mind go to when I hear a poem? And I do use anecdotes in the podcast sometimes. That's less because I think my life is interesting, and more because I'm interested in hopefully making it easier for people to go, no, shut up, I've got my story, and that you can go where your association goes with something else, to show this is how you can do it. Because often I think we need to be taught how to read different forms, and to be taught how to read and given permission to read, to say, if you have an association from your childhood with one word at the end of stanza 2, bring it into your conversation with the poem. It doesn't matter that the poet didn't imagine that. The poet couldn't imagine who was going to read the poem. So the poem is always seeking an audience. And that's part of my interest in the hospitality of literature.
That echoes very nicely with part of your introduction to 44 poems. And maybe it's in Poetry Unbound, but one of those introductions, you said a poem could be addressed to a specific person. It could be addressed to even the dead, but ultimately it's addressed to you.
Yeah.
And that's a very kind of capacious thinking about poetry and its relevance in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're brought in as an eavesdropper to a poem, but there's a consciousness in the production and the distribution of a poem that there are going to be eavesdroppers to it, even if it is addressed to a specific person. The people like us who are going to listen to it get drawn into that. And I love being an eavesdropper.
Here's a fun question. That might be a poem. How'd you get that voice? Did you practice?
I hated my voice as a teenager. I had a tape recorder in my room, and every now and then I'd, out of curiosity, record myself just saying my name and play it back and go, why would anyone be friends with that idiot? So we're all like that, I'm sure. So many of us, when we hear our voice back, just aren't familiar with it.
I think any Americans have a long relationship to Irish poets, as we talked about earlier, and I'm saying 90% was the brogue.
Yeah,
it was definitely brogue.
Yeah.
Hey, I think I'm supposed at this point open it up.
Well, I should say on the question of voice that you would be surprised how many horny 80-year-olds there are in America who, of all the genders, who come to me to say, I sleep with you every night. And there was a couple came up, so I'm part of a throuple in Pittsburgh. This very well-to-do couple came up to me last week. He was wearing a cravat, and so they were very fancy. And they said, we fall asleep to you every night.
That was great.
And I said, oh, thanks very much for, allowing me to be part of your evening. And they said, not our evening, our bed. Like, oh, my God. I know. So, take that, America. You wouldn't get that in Ireland.
Some people burn candles. Some people bring chocolates. Some people put on poetry Unbound. Yeah. Does anyone have a question from the audience? Yes.
So a lot of the work that you've done has been in the area, not just poetry, but theology.
Yeah. I'll repeat it for anyone in the back. My interest in theology and poetry and conflict resolution. I mean, so much of this is so particular to my life in the sense of that I grew up speaking Irish and English, and at the age of 5, I asked my parents, why aren't we speaking Irish all the time? And therefore, that's an introduction to the political reality of living in a country where your language was taken away. So that's an introduction to politics. The Ireland I grew up in was a profoundly Irish Catholic one. And so for me, and I'm a gay man too, and so there was ways of trying to navigate my own curiosity, my own safety, my own fear, the conflict regarding British presence in Ireland, as well as the conflict of being an Irish Catholic who was gay. That all of those things held together, and poetry became like as a very safe place for me to go since I started to write it at the age of 11. I was petrified that anybody would ever read them, so I used to carry them around in a little secret pocket in the back of my school bag because they were disclosures, much more true than anything I ever said in confession. Those were disclosures of truth to myself, not of wrongdoing, but of possibility. And so for me, language is always the space of surprise. And in conflict resolution, what you are fundamentally hoping, God Almighty, I'm thinking about what's happened today, but you're fundamentally hoping in conflict resolution that somebody will say something that's a surprise to them, to themselves, and they'll hear themselves and therefore be brought into the unfolding possibility of what might happen between people. The same way, if you're reading a poem and you can predict the next line, you're thinking, this isn't a very good poem. You want a poem to be caught up in the surprise of itself too. And all of that for me comes from the same kernel of the human imagination.
That's great. I want to very quickly follow up on that, just very quickly, about how not only have you mediated through poetry the questions of conflict, but also spirituality and opening up language as a maybe a non-sacred sacred space by which we address these issues.
Yeah. It's the hope. I've gotten more confident in that as the years have gone by. To feel like, well, no, of course I own these texts. We all do. Yeah. Do what you want with them. Somebody else did. So let's see what happens. And then be prepared to be accountable for what you do.
That's right.
And it's a lot of fun. These texts are extraordinary. I used to feel like a failure because I didn't know the Greek myths very well. And then I studied them, and I am very glad for them. But I know the Christian and Jewish myths, and they're powerful, and they're extraordinary, and they're in such conversation with so many other myths around the world, going one way or going another. And they're a repository for the imagination, and rage, and courage, and betrayal, and all of those things. So, and finding out what's wrong about them is part of the faithfulness of reading them.
Hi.
One of the things that I love about listening to your Unbound episodes is the way.
That's a lovely question. Yeah. Thank you. W.B. Yeats is a huge influence on anybody my age in Ireland because we learned so many of his poems off by heart, from the age of 5 upwards. And Yeats is a very musical poet. And I'm not caught in a tension way, but I'm held in a space between the visual furniture of a poem and the musicality of it. And for me, a poem absolutely begins in music. I hear a music, a beat, a rhythm, not anything of a very strict percussion, but something of an exploration, and I follow that along. So whenever I read anybody's poem, I'm looking for that. But certainly that's where it begins for me, is in some kind of emotional musicality. Yeah. Thank you very much. I love all kinds of music. I should first of all pay homage to Tanita Tikaram, a magnificent singer-songwriter that I've loved since I was 12. I called up my best friend, Cathal. All of the lads in my class had found their music, Guns N' Roses or whoever. And I saw Tanita Tikaram play an acoustic guitar with a string quartet behind her on the television. And I phoned Cathal up and said, I found my music. And he was delighted because suddenly I was going to become cool enough for him to acknowledge we were best friends. And I said, it's Tanita Tikaram. And he said, that is so gay. And never was a truer word spoken. So, but part of it is I play the guitar, and so I loved seeing somebody play the guitar. My sister, all of us play music in the 6 siblings, so my older sister plays the violin beautifully. So I love Irish traditional music. I love Lankum. I love the Bonnie Men, these great contemporary Irish traditional bands, the Gloaming. There are so many, the Ye Vagabonds. It's a very, very rich culture at the moment. Well, it always has been, but there's so much brilliant stuff happening. I love kind of moody Icelandic fellas with a piano and a computer. There's a whole load of them. They seem to be produced by the dozen. Olafur Arnalds and all of those fellas. They're all brilliant. I like Max Richter. I certainly love myself a sincere lesbian with a guitar, which that began with Tanita Tikaram and then continued to the Indigo Girls and Joan Armatrading and Juliet Turner. And I absolutely adore choral music. So Palestrina, I love that. So.
Thank you. That's really important. First and foremost, I try to orient people away from the idea that a poem has to mean something, or that a poem was written for a specific purpose. I love this quote from John Keats about irritable reaching after fact and reason, and that we don't need to do that with poems. We can exist in that space of wonder and mystery. And I think poetry, the great wealth of poetry actually, creates a space for us to embrace nuance. The other maybe passive-aggressive thing I do is give books of poetry to people who are expecting a gift.
That's just aggressive.
Yeah, that's just aggressive.
Nothing passive.
Nothing passive.
No.
Yeah. I think it's about matchmaking too. I've found, let's say, we can think of volumes of poems, but I think about what people are going through and try to fill their text or their email with a poem. One person is deeply in love with Derek Walcott's Love After Love, because that arrived at a moment which heartbreak was a reality and she needed to hear. You love we could say it plainly, and it's not as interesting. You must love yourself before you can love someone else. But those wisdoms are there, and it's just a matter for me of finding matchmaking in a way.
It's lovely. The slowdown is a beautiful way for people to get into music, into poetry, and a reflection on a single poem. I think poetry is in everyone, because it has arisen in every human culture. And so I like what you're saying about matchmaking, because that implies an implicit attraction. I get messages all the time, I'm sure you do too, and lots of us in the room who read or teach, where people go, there's this thing happening in my life or in my friend's life. Do you have anything that might help? There's a guy in England, William Sieghart, who started off the poetry pharmacy, where people could go into a poetry ambulance and say, this is happening for me. I'm changing job and I'm 56 and I'm excited and petrified. Is there a poem? And they'd prescribe a poem. How wonderful. He's got these collections called the Poetry Pharmacy. And I think when you hear that, you go, so many people are looking for that. You're looking for something like a spell, something like a piece of music that weaves its way towards you as a temporary experience. It doesn't have to be sufficient. It just has to be enough. And therefore, I think we're always doing that. And In school, when I was 16, my friend Hans was sitting next to me, and he had just broken up from his girlfriend of 4.5 months, which is a big drama in our classroom. And in chemistry class, he sat, and he was not a poet. He sat and wrote in quatrains in the back of the chemistry book. And the teacher noticed, I noticed, I was next to him, but nobody interrupted him because everybody knew that he was heartbroken. And he turned to verse. And I would never dare to have even glanced in his direction, to have trespassed upon that. So there's something where so many of us turn to language. You know, the earliest poets in the Hebrew Bible were fascinated by that, and that's one of the first things they gave to the God character that they invented, language. God said light, and there was light. But a poet said, God said. And isn't that interesting, that there has been a fascination with language since the word go, and what language can make and what it can break?
Hey, let's thank Pádraig.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Major. Thank you to Parnassus.